This is a GBVIMS video short. This video short is an overview of the intake form. To best follow along, it'll be helpful to have the intake form in front of you. What is the intake form? It's a standardized data collection tool used by service providers when conducting the initial intake interview with survivors of gender-based violence. It helps ensure client confidentiality by eliminating the use of identifiable information. And it helps ensure that all service providers are consistently collecting a standardized set of key GBV data points. There are a few important things to remember as we go through the intake form. First, the intake form should only be used in the context of service provision. This is not a tool to be used just for data collection. The survivor's safety, comfort, and well-being should be the first priority during the entire process. As a general rule, for most of the form, you can only select one box for each data point on the intake form. And finally, there's one thing to never write on the intake form: names. To protect client confidentiality for staff and for alleged perpetrators, no names of staff, survivors, or alleged perpetrators should be anywhere on the intake form. So how can an incident be reported? GBVIMS data is only based upon information collected in the context of service provision, so the survivor must be present when receiving a service. If the survivor is a child or is unable to report due to a disability, a guardian can report the incident if the survivor is present. The key component here is that the survivor must be present to receive services, so we can't collect third-party reports as part of the GBVIMS. There are 6 sections on the intake form: administrative information, survivor information, details of the incident, alleged perpetrator information, planned action or action taken, and the assessment points. We'll go through each of those. First is the administrative information section. This includes the report date, the date the client came to see you, the incident date, the date the incident occurred, and for the date of the incident, if the survivor doesn't remember the exact date, maybe they remember that it happened a month ago, you can estimate. It's important here to estimate the closest to the date that the survivor can remember. Then we have a checkbox that asks if the incident was reported by the survivor. Again, this is an important point for us to remember, that only incidents where the survivor is receiving services and they are present at the time of report will be entered onto the intake form and go into the database. Next, we have the section on survivor information. First, we have the client's age or date of birth. Here we'll indicate the survivor's age, and again, it's important to estimate if necessary. If the client knows they were born in 1987, but doesn't know the exact day or month, we can estimate January 1st, 1987. The next box is to indicate the sex of the survivor, and then the country of origin. Here, this should be locally customized to your setting. What are the top 5 or 6 most common countries of origin of survivors you're serving? And then we have the current civil or marital status: single, married or cohabitating, living together, divorced or separated, or widowed. Then we have the displacement status at time of report. This is where we indicate what the status of displacement of the survivor was at the time they came to see you, at the time they came to seek services. We'll go through each of these. First, asylum seeker. An asylum seeker is an individual who is seeking international protection. In countries with individualized procedures, an asylum seeker is someone whose claim has not yet been finally decided on by the country in which he or she has submitted it. Not every asylum seeker will ultimately be recognized as a refugee, but every refugee is initially an asylum seeker. Or a national. This is a person present in a country who does not currently have the right to permanent residency of that country. Internally displaced person, or IDP. IDPs are people who have been forced to flee their home as a result of, or in order to avoid the effects of armed conflict, internal strife, systematic violations of human rights, or natural or man-made disasters, and who seek protection elsewhere within their country of origin or residence and have not crossed internationally recognized state borders. Refugee. This is a person who is outside of his or her country of origin or habitual residence and has a well-founded fear of persecution because of his or her race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group or political opinion, and is unable or unwilling to avail herself or himself of the protection of that country or to return there for fear of persecution. Returnee. This is a former refugee or internally displaced person who returns to her or his country or area of origin, whether spontaneously or in an organized manner. Resident. This is a person who has never been displaced from their home as a result of or in order to avoid the effects of armed conflict, internal strife, systematic violations of human rights, or natural or man-made disasters. Stateless person. A stateless person is a person who under national laws does not have the legal bond of nationality with any state. Article 1 of the 1954 Convention relating to the status of stateless persons indicates that a person considered a national or citizen automatically under the laws of any state is stateless. Now it's time to test your knowledge. A woman is living in a makeshift settlement. She is from an ethnic group not recognized by the country she currently resides in or any other country as nationals or citizens. She comes to you to report an incident of GBV. What is her displacement status at the time she comes to report to you? If you said stateless, you're right. Because she's from an ethnic group that's not recognized as a national or citizen in any country, she can be considered stateless. A girl's parents sent her to her family friends in a neighboring country to work in their house in exchange for school fees and lodging. She does not have the right to reside there permanently. While there, she comes to you to report that she was raped by the head of house 2 days earlier. What is her displacement status at time of report? If you said foreign national, you're right. She's not in her own country, she's in a neighboring country, but she's not there because of fear of persecution. She's there to work, so we can consider her a foreign national. Finally, a woman who has never been displaced is living in her country of origin when she comes to report an incident of GBV that her supervisor perpetrated against her earlier this week. What is her displacement status at time of report? If you said resident, you're right. The key part here is that the woman has never been displaced, so we can consider her a resident. The next question we have, is the client a person with disabilities? There are several response options here. What's important to keep in mind is that we're talking about long-term disabilities that impair the client's ability to function. So the options are no, the client does not suffer from any long-term disability. The client suffers from a long-term mental disability. The client suffers from a long-term physical disability. For example, they're blind or have no use of their legs, or both mental and physical disability. Then the next question is, the client an unaccompanied minor, separated child, or other vulnerable child? The options here are no, unaccompanied minor, separated child, or other vulnerable child. Other vulnerable child is really a broad category. It can include children who are chronically ill, living without adequate adult support, outside of family care, are marginalized, stigmatized, or discriminated against, or orphans. Separated children are children separated from both parents or from their previous legal or customary primary caregiver, but not necessarily from other relatives. They may therefore include children accompanied by other adult family members. Unaccompanied children are children who have been separated from both parents and other relatives and are not being cared for by an adult who by law or custom is responsible for doing so. Next, we have the stage of displacement at the time of incident. This contrasts from the earlier displacement status we talked about, because this one is at the time the incident occurred. What was their stage of displacement? Let's go through these together. The first one is not displaced or home community. This is a person who at the time of report and the time of incident has never been previously displaced due to the effects of armed conflict, internal strife, systematic violations of human rights, or natural or man-made disasters. Pre-displacement. This indicates that the incident occurred prior to the time that the client was displaced from their home. During flight. The incident occurred while the person was traveling from their home to the place of refuge. During refuge. This indicates that the incident occurred during the period of time when the person was displaced. This includes both internally displaced people as well as refugees. It's important to note here, when we say during refuge, we don't mean during refugee. It really means during displacement. During return or transit. This indicates that the incident occurred while the person was returning back to their home from their place of refuge, from their place of displacement. And finally, post-displacement. This indicates that the incident occurred after the client returned home from their displacement. It can be helpful to view this visually. At the top, we have a pathway that goes from pre-displacement to during flight, during refuge, during return or transit, and finally post-displacement. This is the process of displacement. Below that, in a separate row, you can see not displaced or home community. Because if someone's not displaced or home community, they've never gone through any of the steps of displacement. Now it's time again to test your knowledge. A woman from Syria comes to your organization in Lebanon to report a GBV incident that occurred while she was fleeing her home in Syria 2 years ago. She was forced to flee because of her ethnicity and has not been able to return. She is currently seeking international protection from the government of Lebanon, but her claim has not yet been decided on. So at the time of the incident, what was her status of displacement? If you said during flight, you're right. The incident occurred while she was fleeing her home in Syria. So we can say that this one was during flight. The woman from number 1 comes back 1 month later to report a new GBV incident that occurred this morning. She informs you that since her last report, the government of Lebanon has accepted her claim requesting protection. What is her stage of displacement at the time of incident? If you said during refuge or during displacement, you're right. The incident occurred while she was in a state of displacement. A boy is forced to flee his home and moves to his sister's house in the capital to escape rebel fighting in and around his town. While still living at his sister's house, he comes to you to report an incident of GBV that was perpetrated against him by several rebel soldiers 3 weeks before he left his village for his sisters. What is his stage of displacement at time of incident? If you said pre-displacement, you're right. The incident occurred 3 weeks before he left his village for his sisters. So the incident happened before he was displaced. We can call it pre-displacement. Finally, the boy from number 3 returns home. While home, he goes to a nearby GBV service provider to report another incident of GBV that occurred while in his home community. What is his stage of displacement at time of incident? If you said post-displacement, you're right. The incident occurred after the boy was displaced and returned to his home community. So we can call this post-displacement. Next, under details of the incident, we have the time of day that the incident took place. There are several options: morning, from sunrise to noon; afternoon, from noon to sunset; evening or night, from sunset to sunrise; and unknown or not applicable. You would use unknown or not applicable in an instance where the survivor doesn't know. Maybe they were kidnapped and they're not sure what time of day it was. Maybe it's an incident that occurs at all times of day or night. For example, a woman who's verbally abused by her husband at all times of day. So in that case, we would put unknown or not applicable. Next, we have the incident location. This data point as well will be locally customized to your setting. You may see many different options from what you see on your screen right now. two options that will always be there are survivor's residence and perpetrator's residence. It's important to make a distinction here. If the survivor's residence and the perpetrator's residence are the same house, for example, in a domestic violence situation, our preference for the GBVIMS intake form is to mark survivor's residence. This is important for our analysis, that we know when we're looking at aggregate reports, when we look at the trend of violence in a survivor's residence, we know that their home is a dangerous place. Next, we have the area or sub-area where the incident occurred. This again will be locally customized to your setting. It could include provinces or governorates, cities or camps. You should determine in your setting what's most appropriate. Then we have the account of the incident. This is where you can add 1 or 2 sentences about what exactly occurred for the survivor. What was the incident? It's important to remember here, again, there are no names that we're including anywhere on the intake form. The next question we have is about harmful traditional practices. Here you should indicate if the act was a harmful traditional practice. Again, this data point should be locally customized to your setting. One example that you might include is female genital mutilation. This is one example of a harmful traditional practice. The next question we have is about money, goods, benefits, or services exchanged in relation to an incident. So what we were looking for here is if it's possible exploitation. Let me give you an example. If a boy is promised food aid if he sleeps with a service provider, this would be an example of services exchanged in relation to this incident. Next, we have the type of abduction at the time of incident. The options here are none, forced conscription, being forced to join an armed group against one's will, and this could include porters, soldiers, or sex slaves. Trafficked, recruitment, transportation, transfer, harboring, or receipt of persons by means of the threat or the use of force or other forms of coercion, abduction, fraud, deception, abuse of power, or of a position of vulnerability, or of giving or receiving of payments or benefits to achieve the consent of a person having control over another person for the purpose of exploitation. Trafficking can occur regardless of whether victims are taken to another country or only moved from one place to another within the same country. And finally, other abduction or kidnapping. This is a broad category to capture any other form of abduction or kidnapping reported by the survivor. Then, has the client reported this incident anywhere else? This is a really important question for us to avoid double counting in interagency reporting. The options here are no, the client has not reported this incident anywhere else, or yes, they've reported it to an organization that doesn't use the GBVIMS, or yes, they've reported it to another organization that does use the GBVIMS. When we enter this information into the database, it helps us exclude incidents that are reported to another organization using the GBVIMS, so we're not double counting our aggregate reporting. Then, has the client had any previous incidents of GBV perpetrated against them? Yes or no responses will be entered into the database. There's also an option here to include a brief description for your case management purposes. Then we move on to the section about the alleged perpetrator. As we go through this section, we're responding to this according to the primary perpetrator, the person that directly inflicted the violence or abuse against the survivor. First, we ask for the number of alleged perpetrators. 1, 2, 3, more than 3, or unknown. If the exact number is unknown, but the survivor knows that there were more than 3 should be selected, not unknown. Then we ask for the sex of the alleged perpetrators. If there were multiple perpetrators and they were all male, you mark male. If they were all female, female. If there were both males and females involved, then you can mark both male and female. And finally, the age group of the alleged perpetrator. In your setting, you may have different options. It may be adult, minor, or in the case of multiple perpetrators, if there were adults and minors involved, or you may have more specific age groups, 0 to 11, 12 to 17, 18 to 25, etc. Here again, as with other age questions on the intake form, it's important to estimate if necessary. Then the next question asked about the relationship with the survivor. This is a really important data point for aggregate analysis. It's important to be as specific as possible. The best way to do this is to read the options from top to bottom and select the first option that applies. With this question, we can only tick one box. So here we need to pick one of the primary perpetrators and answer the question accordingly. The next one is about the main occupation of the alleged perpetrator. Here again, it's important to be as specific as possible. And remember that if there are multiple perpetrators, this pertains to one of the primary perpetrators. This question as well, in your setting, the response options may vary according to what's most appropriate in your setting. It's important to note one distinction. There's a difference between armed force and armed group. When we say armed force, we mean a state military group. When we say armed group, we mean a non-state armed group. The next section we move on to is planned action or action taken. The first question here is who referred the client to you? There are a lot of different options. It could be another health or medical provider, a psychosocial provider, a legal assistance provider, the police, a government provider. There are multiple options here that you can choose from. One of them is self-referred. Let's talk a little bit more about that. Self-referred can mean many different things. It can mean that you're the first point of contact for the survivor. That means they didn't go to any other agencies before they went to you. It can also mean if the survivor came in and said, my sister or my friend told me about your services, then you would mark self-referred. If the client came in and said, I heard about your services from a brochure or on the radio, you would also mark self-referred. Next, we have a series of questions asking about the referral pathway. This includes options for safe house, health medical, psychosocial, legal assistance, police, or livelihoods. In your setting, there may be one or two additional options, but these are the core options for the referral pathway. Each of these questions has the same response options. It asks you if you referred the client. If you referred the client, you mark yes. If you didn't refer the client, there are several no options. You could have not referred the client because you yourself provided the service. So then you would mark service provided by your agency. You could have not referred the client because they already received the services from another agency. For example, if somebody needed wound treatment and you're a psychosocial provider, maybe they already went to the health clinic and then they came to see you. In that case, they already received the service from another agency. You might mark service not applicable. This means there's no need. Maybe someone came in to see you reporting verbal abuse. They might not have a need for health or medical attention. So you could mark service not applicable. There's no need. Next, referral declined by survivor. This means there is a need for a referral, but the survivor didn't want the referral. So we'd mark this as declined. And finally, service unavailable. This means that the survivor could have benefited from the services, but for some reason, those services aren't available or accessible to the survivor. So we'd mark service unavailable. In a lot of settings, this is a common response when we're talking about safe houses that might not be present in that setting. It's important to note a distinction between 2 points that are commonly misunderstood in this referral section. We often see confusion between not applicable and unavailable. A service is not applicable when a survivor does not need that service. A service is unavailable when that particular service does not exist or is not accessible in your area. The last section on the form is called the assessment points. This section doesn't go into the database. And in this section alone, you can mark more than one response option. It asks about the emotional state of the client and starts to dig into questions about their safety plan. It also asks if you talk to the client, if it's a case of rape, about possible health consequences. And the last question there is about their consent to share non-identifying information for the purpose of reporting. Back to that in a separate video short on the consent form. Now that we've gone through the entire intake form, it's important for you to try some time to practice this. What we have here is a scenario You can read through the scenario and fill out your intake form on your own. Once you've done that, it's important to talk in your group and go through all of the responses together. Maybe there are points of confusion among your group that you can talk through. At this point in the video, I would pause it, give everyone time to read through this, go through the intake form, and talk about your responses before continuing. Once you come back, let's try one more. Here's another scenario for practice. Take out a fresh intake form, go through this scenario, fill out the data points, and again, discuss with your group. It's really important to go through this process a couple of times. While the intake form might seem very intuitive, it's often that we have confusions and that we're making assumptions about what data points mean. This is a valuable time to talk through each of your responses and make sure everybody is on the same page. So again, here, I'd pause the video and go through the intake form together. We'll wrap up our discussion in this video short by going through the coding. Coding helps protect staff and client confidentiality. You'll see looking at your intake form that there are 3 different types of codes: the incident ID, the staff code, and the survivor code. The staff code is the simplest of the 3 codes. This is assigned to each caseworker, health worker, or other staff that directly interacts with clients and fills out the intake form. The code can be written on this data field on the intake form to keep track of who conducted the interview and provided the service to the client. Typically, staff codes are an alphanumeric code. For example, A1 or A2 or A3. Each staff person gets their own code, and that code never changes. For example, if caseworker A in Site 1 has the code A4, if they leave their job and a new caseworker is hired in their exact position, that new caseworker gets an entirely new code. The code A4 would have been retired when the initial caseworker left the office. Next, we have the incident ID. This code is required for the GBVIMS. It provides the basis for organizing information in the database, and the database won't function without it. This is a unique code that's assigned to every incident reported. So even if a survivor comes in to report multiple incidents over time, each one will have a unique incident ID. You can think of it as each intake form, which represents one incident, has a new incident ID. So there should never be multiple intake forms with the same incident ID. The incident ID will be determined in your setting, but let's give you an example. Your incident ID might include a code for the organization, a code for the site, the staff code, and a sequential incident number. Let's go through an example together. Let's say that you've determined your organization code is A. You've also determined a table of site codes for each site. And you've also determined your staff codes. Let's say we're going with the alphanumeric A1, A2, A3 example. So the 16th survivor reporting to your organization in Site 2 to the staff member A3 would have the code. Why don't you try first? If you said their code would be ADB A3-016, you're right. A is for the organization code. DB, we can see from the table, is for Site 2. The staff code we know is A3, and it's the 16th survivor that this staff person has seen. So the sequential incident number would be 16. This is one example of an incident ID that might vary setting to setting. Next, we have the survivor code. This code will absolutely need to be contingent on the type of clients that you serve in your setting. This is assigned to each survivor to keep their identity protected. This is how we can prevent having any names on the intake form, but still know who the client is. In your setting, you'll need to determine 5 or 6 questions that never change about someone that are appropriate in your setting. For example, your mother's maiden name, the name of your father, your birth order to the mother, or the village or town you were born in. These questions help us build the survivor code. In your setting, you'll determine what are these questions that you can ask each survivor that everyone mostly knows. Then you'll determine what letter of each response will help build your code. Is it the first letter or the third letter? In Arabic settings, you'll probably want to pick the first letter and make that build your survivor code. Once you pick each letter from their response, put them in order, and that creates your survivor code. If you ask a survivor one of these questions, for example, the village or town you were born in, and they don't know, you can replace their response with an X and make that part of your survivor code. So where does the intake form fit into your overall case management process? Let's walk through it together. The survivor comes in and meets with the social worker. The social worker completes the assessment form while meeting with the survivor or after the survivor leaves. The action plan may also be developed with the survivor at this time. Again, all of this depends on what's appropriate in your setting. After the survivor leaves, the social worker completes the intake form. If they're the one that does data entry into the database, they go through with that data entry. If not, they hand it off to the data entry staff for completion. And this is how it fits into the overall case management process. Thank you for watching this GBVIMS video short on the intake form. As always, be responsible with your data and learn more at gbvims.com.